Today on the Social Studies Show, we have Reggie Casagrande. Reggie is an integrated marketing expert with extensive brand development, strategy, and digital communications experience. She has spent the last decade building culture, entertainment, and sports marketing programs, activating athletes, perfecting the digital activation model, and connecting brands to the culture. Some clients include Oakley, Nike, Adidas, Converse, Pepsi, McDonald's, Reebok, Blue Bottle, Electronic Arts, and Maserati. Growing up abroad as a third culture kid was her inspiration for becoming a cultural marketer. Her professional journey started in the early 2000s in NYC as a streetwear photographer and art director, working with athletes and hip-hop artists, which developed her passion for blending youth culture and sports with street style. Today we're here with Reggie Casagrande. You have done so much. It's funny because I came to meeting you through Bruno Musso, who was telling me about your days of New York streets, photography, editorial arts, just being in the New York scene, right? And so he was like, you gotta meet my friend Reggie out here in LA now. Have you two not met? And I was like, how have we not met? So, boom, here we are, doing the Social Studies Show, talking about your career, and you've had a storied career. You've worked for Adidas, Oakley, you've had your own design agency, you've done paper magazine. So I guess for me, I guess if you can just tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and how you got started and how you got into this world and what you're doing nowadays.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be on here, and I was so excited to meet you. It's always great to meet kindred spirits and like-minded folks to talk about culture especially. I started my career as a creator. So I was a photographer in New York, kind of came up in the street culture community. I shot a lot of athletes, did a lot of album packages. I was involved in casting and kind of branding, and worked for about 10, 12 years in that industry. And then unfortunately, when the music industry collapsed and the publishing industry collapsed, I had to pivot. So I kind of started working for an agency that was specialized in sports styles. So that was kind of, it was after the Urahara movement in Tokyo with streetwear, but we worked with a lot of international clients. So I'm working with Nike, worked with Neighborhood, Supreme, a few other folks that were already around at that time, building, I guess you could essentially say the collaboration model. So this was kind of around the time that, before the time that drop culture started, right? Because that was sort of accelerated during the digital transformation, but got more involved in that. And then my first job working in a brand was at Adidas. So I was really excited to also get there around the time that Kanye and Pharrell got there as well. So watch that brand kind of pivot from a $4 billion brand to a $14 billion brand very quickly, relatively, in a few years. So that was a really interesting time to be there. And then I went to Converse from there, worked there during the time that Tyler, the Creator, was there, Miley Cyrus was there. So again, being part of the team to kind of drive relevancy for that brand, right? Because they had kind of gotten a little dusty.
And so within that, and I know something that's really focused, and I was looking at your Business of Fashion article of just the acceleration and the importance of female influence and sales in female-oriented streetwear and athletic wear. So if you can tell us a little bit about that and what that means to you and how you've gone about driving that forward as far as intersectionality of culture.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting about working in the sneaker, streetwear, and sports space for me is it's predominantly driven by men. Men are the main consumer, they're the main decision makers, they're the main stakeholders, and all of that sort of created this juggernaut, you could say, of what the street culture and streetwear industry has become now, but it kind of left out a woman's perspective, right? So you realize that a lot of these bigger brands, they've reached, I don't want to say a plateau necessarily, but they got to a point where they weren't nascent anymore and they couldn't grow. And then they said, how are we going to change that? And realize that, with data and with the consumer insights that we had, that women were a huge opportunity.
A huge consumer.
Yes, and very often the decision maker of who, how money will get spent within a household, right? So women became a big priority at Adidas. Because when I got there, it was kind of seen as a dusty men's soccer brand, and obviously had sort of repositioned itself as a streetwear player, street culture player, with more of an emphasis on women. And they did amazingly well with that. There was huge growth, both across the digital channels, across sales. It was more kind of convincing a female consumer, hey, this is a brand for you as well. And I think now you have that starting to happen in the streetwear industry, where you have brands like, an Undefeated, or, different streetwear players that are like, maybe we need to consider that as well.
So I have a question for you then. What does that path look like from going from neglecting the end consumer to all of a sudden driving and establishing relevance in your brand and bringing that across to a consumer and rolling that out to a brand that maybe hasn't done that before?
Right. So, it's probably a multi-pronged approach in the sense that obviously you need your strategy and your roadmap and whatnot, but, it's a lot of different factors. You need buy-in from senior leadership, the founders, whoever that might be, where they say, we want to back this, we're interested in doing this. Then you need to put mechanisms in place so that tactically you can, just as simple as, size runs, right? Typically with sneakers, size runs don't go below a 7 men's, right? And that is typically too big for most women. So at Converse, for example, we changed our size runs to go down to 4. So that, obviously when you're thinking about a global sort of tactical approach, in Asia, people typically have smaller feet, for example, right? So, and Asia's a huge market for sneaker culture, for streetwear. So, thinking about that, like how are we going to approach size runs? How are we going to build apparel propositions to feature a unisex proposition where a woman could actually fit into the product? Are we going to communicate that in our marketing, in our communications, in our in the models in the store, within the mannequins, right? So all of that, one of the things when we were at Adidas, we were talking about the mannequins. There were no female mannequins wearing the clothes.
Interesting.
So all of those things had to kind of be fixed in order to get to where we wanted to go, right?
So when you're looking at that and you're changing size and you're doing a paradigm shift as far as like female like that, something that's really pivotal to you is looking at collabs and partnerships. And so how do you go about, what kind of process when you're like doing that, establishing that relevancy? Do you start looking at collabs and like who you're going to partnership and work with? And then as far as like brands, obviously they've been for a long time, how do you look at maybe the heritage of what a brand has been and maybe carry that forward to seeing where that is going to actually push into the future, and like use that strategy to align on all those different levels to come up to a collab and release it for the end consumer?
Yeah, it's definitely a longer process than people think. Some brands are obviously reactive. That's definitely not the best approach. But I think there's obviously got to be a strategic reason or initiative in place as to why we're doing collaborations, right? Because essentially it does dilute your inline proposition. Because what happens is the consumer gets kind of used to this idea of hype and collaborations, and they only want that. Then they don't necessarily want what's at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Okay. Which is your regular everyday offering of your Air Force One or your Stan Smith or your more generic proposition, right? So what happens is a company will have to decide kind of where they want to be and why. Okay. What they're going to be activating against, which is usually a cultural calendar. Where they want, it might be the year of the blank or whatever. We want to, drive youth culture through this. Then you go through a whole process of defining like who those relevant partners are and where they can fit potentially within a collaboration construct, right? Mm. That's how I like to approach it with my clients and within the brands that I work in, or my team that we're working in, because, in order to say, hey, we're going to do 2 really large things at the top that are going to resonate globally, we need to find partners that do that. Because, there's people hitting you up all the time. Brands getting hit up. At Oakley, literally every other day someone was emailing like, want to do a collab, we want to do this, we want to do that. And the thing is, the brand has to have a point of view on why would we work with this partner and what is it we're trying to do. So if you're trying to drive a running initiative, then chances are you're going to look for a partner that's relevant in the running space.
So
right?
In that questioning, right, and you were talking about reactive, how do you personally stay proactive, stay up on date on culture, looking at fashion, art, and trends, and then kind of like seeing where things are going to lead to? Because again, obviously if you're reactive, you're kind of coming at the tail end of a trend and moving too late on the time scale. So for you personally, like what advice could you give people and brands about being proactive in culture?
Well, I would say, part of it is really establishing cultural initiatives within a company, right? And you see this happening right now with what happened with Louis Vuitton, right? Mm-hmm. Louis Vuitton came out and announced that they were going to reposition themselves as a cultural brand. And that is going to start happening more and more and more in the future.
So a question of that, where would you see Moncler right now?
I see Moncler in a pretty good position. I mean, they're definitely a little bit quieter and under the radar. They're not quite as hype, but I mean, Moncler's always done really interesting work. I think all luxury brands, are really dabbling in the street culture space.
Well, it was just interesting seeing their whole outbid that they did for the fashion show for Paris and just how many people they brought and how many cultural leaders they brought in. So that's why I asked that question. I was just curious to get your take of like that whole initiative. And do you think it moved the needle? Did you feel that as far as like being like, okay, they're onto something here? Like, how would you describe that?
I mean, kids, and when I see kids, I mean anyone under 35, right? Kids are interested in what entertainers are doing and what cultural figures are doing, right? Okay. That we know that from data and insights, right? When you think about that famous photo of Kanye, Don C, Virgil at Fashion Week in 2009, right? When they couldn't even get into the shows. It's that famous Tommy Tan photo, right? Who would have thought that a few years later, Virgil would be leading Louis Vuitton and Don C would be the creative director of Mitchell & Ness and the Chicago Bulls, and Kanye West would have had Yeezy and all these things, right? So, they were seen as the other and the outsiders, and now that industry, or the luxury industry at least, has completely embraced them because they understand that they drive culture forward, right? So I think, and that's one thing why the Black Renaissance was such a powerful movement within street culture and streetwear, is it really set the tone for, hey, we need to be more inclusive and bring representation in, and we're going to grow that way and drive culture, right? So, sorry, I missed the original question. I think
that's okay. Honestly, that's great.
We went down a rabbit hole there.
But I love the rabbit hole because it's like a deep dive. No, I love a good pivot. Because here's the whole thing where you're like, look at that, and you're talking about the Black Renaissance now, right? And so for me, I look at that as far as like, okay, what do you see that as far as like culturally, as far as like Asian or Indian culture? Because I know that you lived in India for a while, or Pakistan. Sorry, my bad. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at that with the LGBTQ plus community, so it's like all these cultural relevancy, and even like when you start adding in music and art and a renaissance in that vein, right? How does it start extrapolating? How does it start spreading its wings so all these different things go? And then like within that, it's a brand, it seems like it could be a little bit overwhelming. And so that's why I asked, kind of like looking at the heritage, right? I'm like, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. But this is where we're going to go and see where the future, and like also being like, we're going to back up these people who are the future from our heritage of that. So that's where I kind of get curious about seeing how those lines go, because when you look at it, like let's say, I've had a few interesting things as far as like brand alignments where you see things like the North Face with their, outdoors for everyone kind of spearheaded by Patagonia. But then you have like the Bud Light, where I'm trying to think of the influence of
Verity did a collab with
and
that.
So looking at that where, that had all this kind of like blowback, but also like looking at what brand ideals were, where people stand for it, and then just seeing how teams go as far as how they go about like, these are our ideals, this is who we stand for, this is who we are as a people, and maybe taking a short-term hit, but for a long-term prosperity as far as like ideals and legacy and who we want to be and long-term profitability.
Right. Well, there's a lot of questions in that.
There's a lot of questions like that because Okay, I'll make it short, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would definitely say that a brand obviously wants to align with a partner that shares their ideals, right? And their value and vision propositions, right? Typically, when you're doing a collaboration, there has to be a mutually beneficial reason for both partners to come together, right?
Okay.
Typically, in the past, that has been based on some sort of product innovation, right? So, for example, Arc'teryx or North Face might partner with someone that has access to a certain community that they want to enter into, or it might be a company like a Gore-Tex that has a unique kind of, some sort of technology, or, like where you see maybe Rick Owens partnering with Adidas because he can't make performance running shoes, right? But he's an athlete in himself. So that makes sense for that partnership, right? Or, Palace and Adidas, Palace didn't make skate shoes, Adidas does. So those kinds of things make sense. Now what's happening is it's just grown into this, to quote Conor Oberst, in the sense that we're living in the age of promiscuous collaboration, right? We have so many collaborations happening across non-endemic sectors now. You have food and beverage collaborations, you have car collaborations, you have I'm making it up, but Virgil doing the Drake airplane, right? I mean, I'm not making it up, but it wasn't an official, it was a collaboration, but more for hype. But, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw influencers starting to build homes. I mean, it's beyond what it could be, right? It could be anything, essentially. So I think it has to make sense, right? And usually what that influencer or smaller brand or hype partner, whatever you want to call them, one thing they're bringing to the table is cultural relevance within a youth culture community or space, right?
No, it's like one of the more interesting ones I saw was the Sean Witherspoon Porsche one. And like that one was just kind of like, okay, they're obviously trying to tap into the community. So basically shortening up my longer question there is like basically how multicultural teams outperform homogenous ones. And so that's where it kind of like, that's a short version of that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in general, just from working and as a photographer and a creator and artist, I always had multicultural teams, right? Because it's just more fun that way. And that's just kind of how I have my social circle anyway. But I think I really realized that when I started working for Adidas, and it's a quite an international group of folks, quite multicultural, you're just going to get more innovative solutions from people, right? So there is data that proves that multicultural teams outperform homogenous ones, and I think that's what corporate America and global corporate culture is finally realizing now, is we need to elevate all types of people into the C-suite so that we can get more interesting ideas and find solutions, right? Because you can't just have a bunch of people that all have the same background, all went to the same school, or from the same part of the country, or whatever, that have the same references and interests, come up with a global solution, because that's what we need now. We're living in a globalized economy. I think another thing kind of was going to gaming and esports, right?
Okay.
When you were talking about all these different spaces. And there's so much intersectionality there within the IRL and the digital space. And I think esports and gaming is a perfect example of how that, how the real world kind of comes to life in the metaverse and alternate universes and world building, that kind of thing. So I think that's why you're seeing more companies now say, oh, we want to get more involved in that. We want to partner more with gaming athletes, esports athletes, gaming creators, because they speak to a multitude of consumers globally. And there's no language barrier there. So that's why it's such a big potential opportunity, right?
So taking it from a different perspective, because I think we always talk about how the business modus operandi of how those things go. And I want to get just down to like the visceral of how you came to being interested in other people's perspectives and being curious, because you had mentioned before that you're a diplomat's daughter, you grew up in different countries like that. So I'd like to know a little bit how you're just like your baseline curiosity as a child has kind of like led you to this, to being and keeping that modus operandi now in business.
Yeah, I mean, I think just from my background of always living in different cultures, I was a third culture kid, which basically means you grow up in a culture that isn't your own, But it's almost like you don't really have your own culture per se, because you're always moving and adapting. Yeah, and you're kind of adaptable in that sense, right? And growing up, all of my peers were in, they were either military brats or diplo brats, or, worked in, their parents were expats. So it was very normal to grow up like that and move very often, speak different languages, and feel comfortable with change. So I think for me, that really drew me into being a cultural marketer, because I'm interested in change. I'm very comfortable with pivoting very quickly. I'm very adaptable, and comfortable speaking to different subcultures, right? Being able to go into those subcultures and have an authentic connection with whoever those stakeholders are, right? Where I'm not someone who's trying to take advantage of them. I'm there to really provide a platform for them and enable them to potentially be more creative, or have access to brands, or access to resources, or access to money, or whatever it might be that I can contribute to that community.
No, it's nice seeing and thinking about you being a conduit to showcase new different things and new ideas, and kind of like using that to streamline, to almost be like a megaphone for things in communities that maybe aren't getting heard as much, or like you just seeing like in like just understanding and seeing talent. And like one thing I would actually be curious to know, and like in these places, like how do you discover new talent? And how do you like help mentorship and like bring people to the forefront when you find these people who are like, they've obviously got some talent, but maybe they don't know how to like maneuver that way? Like what's your method there?
My MO.
Okay.
Well, I go out a lot.
Okay. Hey, there's nothing wrong with that.
I go out a lot. No, I'm just close to the street, in the sense that I'm out and about. I'm up in the mix. I'm always meeting people. I'm talking to people. I'm curious about people. I'm always trying to take the time. If I discover like a young band or a young designer or a young dancer, I become their friend and essentially like learn more about them and their community, and that's actually how I kind of meet people and put people together. Part of what I do and this kind of goes back to when I was even a photographer and interested in casting, it was like discovering people. I like finding people before they're famous or before they've gotten to a certain level, and really helping them, enabling them. And some of the influencers that I work with, I've been working with them since they were teenagers. So, it's that relationship building thing. Mentorship's a big thing for me.
So I have a funny thing. Are you familiar with Virgil's Free Game?
No, actually.
It's a website where he basically talks about how you can go about basically brand building. It's a full step-by-step on his website, and it's called Free Game right there,
Amazing.
Right? So it's like funny with you talking about this, the way you have, like you need to make your own website called Cheat Codes.
Well, those are like dropping gems, right? Or Easter eggs.
Well, like I'm not even totally serious, because like when we talked about stuff, we were talking about some pitching, some proposals for different things that we were working on, right? And like I gave you a couple ideas, and you kind of like go back there, and then you're like, hit G, F, left, down, and like gave me the cheat code, and like, here's who you need to talk to, here's what you need to do, here's how it goes. And I was just like, thanks, wow, like no one ever really like makes it that simple to give me the cheat code, So I was just like, man, like Reggie just made my life so much simpler, So I think really like that's something you got to look into, because you got the cheat codes, girl.
Yeah, I mean, I it's funny because I did a couple like little streetwear classes and stuff here and there, and I think just having like some of those codes, right, or some of those kind of secrets in your back pocket make things so much easier. And sometimes people are like, oh, I want to do this with a big brand, and they might just not understand the levels and the complexity within a large organization or a matrixed organization of who actually controls decision making, how things need to be presented. And sometimes I will literally sit with a young designer or brand, and I will help them build their documents and say, you need to sell it in like this.
Yeah.
Because right now it's not going to work.
And like, cheat codes.
Yeah. And, it's like, and that's what I can give them. And I enjoy giving that to them, right? Well, because it's a learning too.
That's a very gracious thing, because when you look at that and you're like coming from maybe a marginalized community who maybe hasn't had as much access like that, like it's so hard to discover how to maneuver those things. And I know with myself, just talking to younger people who ask me about my career and stuff like that, sometimes there's so much determination and just like things they want to do. People are so busy trying to run through the brick wall, they're rather just walking around it.
Right.
And so I think sometimes it's really important to like understand that maybe there are some cheat codes, and maybe you don't have to like grind so hard. Maybe you can just be like a couple smarter things with a couple key moves here.
Right.
And I think that's a beautiful thing when people kind of like, because you can just be sitting there running on the treadmill and somebody can just be like, hey, come hop on this escalator.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So I think that's a very pivotal thing when like you understand the value of that, because like just by giving that one little like thing, like how much personal satisfaction or just like space that you're giving that person to be able to bring other things into their life, because they're grinding so hard. It's one thing, but like if you give them just a moment of respite, they can actually expound on their creativity.
Right, and they can use that information to also help them with other projects and moving forward in their kind of quest as an entrepreneur too, right? Even if they're, obviously, even as a creative person, if you're a designer or an artist or whatever it might be, essentially you're an entrepreneur because it is a business if you want to make it sustainable, right? So you need to kind of have that left brain, right brain, skill set together. And understands that it's not just about creating all the time. It's about, if you don't have time to do that and you have the resources, then you need to build a team of people to come in and help you do that if you can't do it, right? But part of it is, even at in an organization at the highest level, we're selling things in every other day. Because, we could sit there and say, hey, we want to do this, this, and this, and these are all great ideas, but, there's always someone above us who's going to sign the check and say yes or no, why does this make sense, when are we going to do it? So that idea of selling things in is a big process.
Well, one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever heard, right, is for doing a marketing project or a DI thing, right, you have to sell the CFO, not the CMO. Because the CFO writes the checks.
That's right.
And so if the CFO doesn't believe it, then you're not going to get the funding to do thing, and the CMO's hands are tied. So it's like a funny thing of just, that's literally one of those, that little key thing has been like such a
Right. Well, or you need to give the CMO the tools to access this, right? Because usually you're not going to have access to a CFO, right? They're stuck in an office like pencil pushing and like doing number crunching.
But even then, learning what they care about, what they like, or what are their ideals, what are their
what's the return on investment?
Like, what's their thing? Because it could be that, because you got to tell them how you're going to like make money in the thing, but also what do they care about?
Right.
So there's a lot of different things that there is, because it can be financial, it can be psychological too. So it's an interesting thing of that. One of my other questions for you, as far as collabs and partnerships and endorsement deals, do you like dealing with athletes or celebrities more, or is there either or? What are the benefits? What are some of the takeaways of like either or?
Well, I mean, honestly, I've been working with both for my whole career. I find them both very, very interesting. Athletes, to me, are incredible people because they are so driven and focused, and they basically give up their life to do their sport, right? What I find interesting, and that's very inspirational to me, the focus and the professionalism that with which they operate. And even just, when I worked at Oakley in sports marketing, everyone on our team is an athlete. Mm-hmm. So working with athletes, athletes are able to handle stress a lot better than normal people or non-athletes. So I think, I definitely have a soft spot in my heart for athletes for many reasons. I think on a cultural level, what's interesting in working with entertainers, especially people like a Pharrell or a Tyler, the Creator, is that they're polymaths, right? Mm-hmm. They're able to transcend their particular space very easily and move fluidly across different creative sectors. So I think that's very interesting, and that's not necessarily something that an athlete can do, because they're so focused from very, very young on just doing their sport, right? And then they get to the highest level of that sport, and then you might have an athlete though, like someone like a Trevor Andrew, for example, who I love, who you know, I'm sure. And he, after he left his sport, essentially, or at least the Olympic, podium part of his sport, he became, Gucci Ghost and started making art. And
well, Trouble Andrew first, because he started the brand.
Yeah, that's right, Trouble Andrew, that's
music.
right. He's always been a very multi-hyphenate creator, Trevor, right? But, and Trevor's unusual in that sense, because you're not always going to find an athlete that is that interested in all those creative outlets, right? But, I think I definitely do like working, and that's why Virgil was so amazing, because he was, came from an engineering background, but he had understood architecture, understood design, fashion, styling, music. He was an amazing DJ.
He was into skateboarding, he was snowboarding. Exactly. It was just funny, all the things he was doing.
Yeah, and that is so inspiring, right? So it's definitely a little bit different. But I think, either way, both are figures that young folks relate to, and both are figures that are aspirational. And so I think depending on the right project, you find the right partner. There's a reason why, and I think what's interesting now, just let's talk about the tunnel walk for a second, right? The tunnel walk is now, by GQ magazine, being called the most influential runway in the world, right? And I think, 5-10 years ago, athletes weren't seen as fashionable. They were wearing big ugly suits, they weren't wearing cool shit.
Well, they were trying to be fashionable, and then they found stylists.
Yeah, except for Allen Iverson, right? Allen Iverson was always fashionable, right?
Well, he was the whole thing. He was being fined. And, it's interesting thinking about the Jordan with the shoes getting fined for that.
Yeah, for breaking the color barrier.
Yeah, that. So it's interesting because at first everyone was just wearing sweats. And they went to big suits that basically look like zoot suits, thing like that.
The Charles Barkley era.
Yeah, it's so out of control. And so then it got into fitted, where even now, it's funny because I was just watching Shannon Sharp's leaving show yesterday, and she was that might be a little too fitted. It's just
now they're wearing skirts.
It was just about to just blow out the seams of the thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, but again, it has become a thing of okay, the tunnel walk of here's the product, here's what LeBron's wearing, here's the shades that's going on. When to go break his score, he did his whole tunnel. He's I'm coming out, here's what I'm doing, I'm gonna break this record tonight, right? Here's my fit. It's done, right? So it's interesting looking at those type of things and really seeing that even at sporting events. It's funny, because now even at F1. Right?
Yeah.
There's just the Monaco F1
yes.
and the Miami. And so now all the celebs going down pit lane, checking their outfits as far as that goes. And then people doing their integrations of alcohol integrations into the parties and F1. So it's funny to see how all these things are going.
Vegas is next. That's going to be off the hook. And I was actually surprised to see, it's interesting that you brought up the F1 because there were so many female influencers there. And I was just wow, this is really interesting because typically F1 has kind of stayed a bit niche. Now it's become much more cultural. And I think Lewis Hamilton is partly, he is responsible for driving that.
They've started a whole women's initiative series on F1. I can't remember.
Yes,
I think
I
it's
saw
through
that.
F1 or F2. It's F2 or F3 cars that they're starting them to virtually basically get an F1 female driver. And so, because that was basically when F1 was redoing their contracts, part of the whole thing was looking at how they're going to push that initiative, and it was a whole pushback because the whole initiative at the time now it's losing money, but but where's the long term, right?
Yeah,
so it's something new. Anything
you spend money to make money.
You have to invest in that thing, and so it's the long play. And I think that's where it comes into even just seeing that with DEI and just some things we've talked about with mentorship and again standing by who your character is. Sometimes you have to you're going to lose some ground to gain some long-term ground, and I think that's the hard people watching things, especially just with the I guess cross-cultural kind of LGBTQ marketing right now. There's been a lot of pushback, especially kind of from the administration as far as Trump and even legislation of
it's
book
been
banning,
horrible.
right?
A book banning, the anti-trans laws.
So
it's
gut
terrible.
reaction of things of when you think about what was America built on, freedom of speech,
diversity.
Yeah. Basically coming over to escape oppression.
Yes.
Right? And so then all of a sudden you're that's what you're feeding. So I think you kind of sometimes you know, you have to take a look in the mirror of like what you're actually trying to, because who are you trying to protect and who are you trying to save?
Right.
And like, what are you trying to get across for this country and as far as ideals? So neither here nor there, but getting back to some of your favorite brand activations or meaningful projects, because we want to know about you.
Yeah, I mean, there have been quite a few that I've loved, big and small. I think most recently from the athlete side, I mean, there's obviously a few things I'm working on right now that I can't talk about, but I'm very excited about, and they're coming out this fall. But I think from the athlete side, you know, being able to work with Kylian Mbappe at Oakley was just incredible. Working on all his signature drops and the collections, and you know, he is such a stellar human being and so professional, and you know, really a star. And you know, I'm you know, for me it was kind of like, when I was in Brazil as a child, you know, it was the Pele era, and I just kind of see him as like carrying that torch on. You know, he will be the next Pele for that generation, and he's so focused on his charity and doing good and being kind of the children's hero and all this stuff. So that was pretty amazing, working on that one. And then one thing I worked on at Converse that I loved working with Don C. He's great, Don Crowley. And, you know, he's just the dire professional and very creative and collaborative. And we did a really fun collaboration with him for Converse, that we had a big activation in New York, and you know, tons of influencers and media showed up, and it was just you know, he's a great partner and he has great taste and he's a lovely person. So you know, that for me, you know, when I think about some of my favorite partners or collaborators or projects, it's really not just about the product you make, it's about the process, it's about the professionalism, you know, and working at a certain level. You know, I like to work at an elevated level where everybody's firing on all cylinders, right? You're working with the best talent. You have the you know, obviously you don't always have huge resources, but if you have a group of really professional people that are all trying, everyone is vested, everyone's excited about the project, you know, and you have folks that care about pushing culture, then you're going to have a great outcome. And so that's kind of what I'm always looking for when I'm meeting young creators and young folks that I, you know, mentor with or bring into my community or whatever. I'm always looking for, is this somebody that is open? Is this someone who is professional, who wants it, who has the grit to really work hard to get to the next level? And, you know, for me, that's what I'm looking for. And that's what I'm looking for when I hire people too. You know, I'm looking for someone who is going to work hard and has that passion and energy. You know, I'm all about big energy, so I want people around me that feed that positive energy and play off each other's energy, and I think that's what I felt when we met, right?
Yeah, we're vibing. We're vibing. Boom! No, I think the other thing that too is like, within that context, right, is not complacence. Like for me, like I like people who know and are looking or trying to see what's over the next hill.
Right.
Like what's over the next hill? What's next? Because you're excited thing. I'm like, there's definitely a time to like sit down and celebrate the wins, but man, I'm always just like, what's next? What's next? What's next? Like I'm like sometimes like I chill myself.
Yeah.
Right?
And speaking of that too, you know, my thing is when you ask me about like how do I find these things, like my thing is always like what's bubbling, right? So sometimes I'll do work with clients on what's coming, what's bubbling, like under the radar, you know, and you know, like how are sports being disrupted, you know, what's happening. You know, you think about like Nigel Sylvester and what he's doing on bicycles, and there's kids in New York that are doing crazy stuff on bicycles, and you know just what's happening in other subcultures within youth that are, you know, different types of dance, different formats, different, you know, people disrupting certain things. Like that's where I'm always interested. Like what's going on here that's cool, you know, that kids will think is cool, and like how can we enable these folks to kind of take it to the next level, right?
Interesting. So I think my last question I have for you before we wrap it up here is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Wow. Well, I'm definitely a Reggie get a move on it person, so I would probably say take my time a little more.
Enjoy the ride, just we're talking about what's over the hill.
Yeah, because I'm always like on to the next thing. I think, understanding, and now that I'm a little bit older, I also understand that things happen for a reason. And sometimes, your career path is not a ladder, it's a jungle gym. So you might be moving across things.
Laterally to make the,
exactly.
So sometimes you gotta see that you can move back to move forward.
Exactly. So understanding that dynamic and just, I think being strategic is important in everything you do, right? Understanding that decisions have consequences and being able to make good decisions in life, good decisions in your career, aligning yourself with good people that are having a positive influence on you is important. So I try to kind of live those values in my career and in my personal life.
No, that's a great lesson. I mean, obviously, I was like, someone's seen some battle wounds.
I have definitely seen a few of those, for sure.
But also, you've lived to fight another day, so that's amazing. And I love your resiliency and seeing what you come up with next. And I'm just excited for your next chapter. So thank you so much for joining us on the Social Studies Show. I learned a lot, and I hope the viewers did. So it's just great to connect and finally put it together.
I love talking culture, Stan. So anytime.
Bet.
Thank you.
Awesome. If you enjoyed the Social Studies Show, please hit like and subscribe. If you found the information in the program relevant and insightful, copy the link, share it with your friends. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. These small gestures help increase the awareness and growth of our show. Thank you.